Welcome to part 2 of the brushes I use most often. These are the brushes for creating man-made textures. In part 1 of this series, I focused on the brushes I use for designing, drafting, and adding basic tone to sketches. In this part 2 of 3, I'm going to show you the brushes and techniques I use to create man-made material textures. Now, I'm selecting and filling a layer for each of the surfaces in this sketch to give us a real rendering to work with, and to make the point that rendered textures don't exist in a vacuum. They have to obey the laws of perspective, the same as the surfaces to which they are applied. For example, here's a stone texture brush I bought from a store on Etsy. Painting with it is essentially like rolling out a photograph of marble, and that's okay. But it can't really be used in this condition. It has to be modified in order to work with the rendering. Returning to our simple sketch, if I select the area of the floor and roll out this texture without any transformation, it ends up looking flat and a little cartoonish because the texture of the grain is the same everywhere in the room. On the other hand, if I roll out the same patch of stone texture, but this time I select it and use the transform tool to distort that selection into perspective, then the grain of the stone contributes to the illusion of perspective, with texture that converges to a vanishing point at the horizon. Creating stone texture, or really any texture this way, using the transform tool to distort a flat patch into perspective, then trimming that patch to fit the shape of the floor or the wall you're working with, creates a more believable texture, in my opinion, than just applying the texture flat. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at the limited set of brushes I use to simulate architectural materials, starting with the Nikko Rull Brush, the Turpentine Brush, the Artist Crayon Brush, the Fine Hair Brush, and its cousin, the Flowing Hair Brush. And out of respect for the master of literal painting, Bob Ross, who inspired me as a kid, I'll also include the stone brush we already discussed, the corrugated iron brush, and the water brush. Let's start with a Nikko Rull Brush, shown here being applied in full and partial opacity, and the Turpentine Brush, which can be smeared or tapped to create wonderful, unpredictable textures, and the Artist Crayon Brush, and there are lots of brushes very similar to this one. These three are currently my go-to brushes for creating generic texture that could really look like anything, from poured concrete to Venetian plaster to even an asphalt parking lot. The trick is to use them at a fraction of 100% opacity so they blend in with whatever other shading or shadow you're applying to the wall. When I want the texture to actually be in perspective, my technique is to create a large and hopefully uniform patch of the texture I want, then select and transform that patch to match the perspective properties of the surface to which I am applying it. Once the adjustments are made, I then trim the edges of the layer to the wall layer below, and I'm ready to go. One great advantage of keeping your textures on different layers is that you can later go in and select that layer, add a new layer on top of that, then recolor or reblend that layer in any number of ways, giving you more flexibility in developing or changing your design in real time as you're creating the rendering. The newly recolored area will, of course, have exactly the same texture as the original layer. Now here's the same technique used with the Artist Crayon. A uniform layer of texture is created larger than the shape to which you are applying it. Then the layer is transformed to create the illusion of depth through the manipulation of perspective. In this case, I adjust the transparency of the layer afterwards in the layer menu itself. So that covers the creation of some generic textures. Now let's apply the same idea to making wood grain. Again, one can use the standard wood grain brush available in the Procreate brush menu, but this is only a photo of wood flooring or wood paneling, and you will most likely want to create your own wood textures depending on your design. For making custom wood surfaces, I start with either the Fine Hair Brush or the Flowing Hair Brush. Step 1 is again selecting the surface we want to apply the texture to. But this time I'm going to make my brush strokes converge toward the vanishing point in order to create the illusion or perspective right away without needing the transform tool later. My lines aren't perfectly straight because I'm trying to create wood with a more random, natural grain and not a highly processed wood. Once the top is done, I can go back in and select the front of the object, then apply wood grain lines on a new layer, and these are now vertical like the face of the object itself. It's hard to tell from this angle, but I'm varying the weight with which I press down so as to make the grain lines lighter or darker. I can also go back in and adjust the brightness of the underlying face of the object to create more or less of an illusion that the object is backlit by the large window at the rear of the room. Now, we already made some stone with one of the ready-made brushes, but let me show you how I create my own marble texture by using these same few basic brushes and these same techniques. Here I begin with a Nikko Rull Brush at very low opacity, and I apply a very light coat of the texture over the wall to the right. This will serve as a sort of background noise of the marble paneling that I'm creating. Next, I'm going to select the technical pen brush, and at a very low opacity, I begin to suggest the dark veins that run through marble. I usually look at a reference photo while I'm doing this to make sure I've got the particular kind of marble right. But here I'm just making it up from memory, while still trying to make the geometry of the pattern of lines obey the laws of perspective. By having this veining on its own layer, I can adjust the brightness, duplicate the layer, merge it down to make it darker, and even erase some of it to make it appear to fade out at the end of the wall. It's not my most realistic effort, but you get the idea. Now let's see what these textures look like if we add some strong sunlight to the room. First, I'm going to map out the shape of the patch of sun I imagine hitting the floor. Now I'm going to add a new layer of black to the room, adjust the opacity, then select and delete the areas that I want to be in full sunlight. The remaining shade is a little too uniform, so I use the soft brush in eraser mode to delete some of the black and brighten the corners of the room, leaving the border between the light and the shadow as the area with the most contrast. Before I show you the water brush texture, I'm just going to quickly paint in some sky and a body of water outside the window at the rear. Now I can select the water texture brush. Adjusting the scale of the texture, I create a layer larger than the area to which it will be applied. I transform that patch into perspective, converging at the horizon. I reverse the color from black to white. I make a few final adjustments, and boom, David Hockney's swimming pool right outside our window. That's it for part 2 of the brushes I use. Thanks for watching, and next week look for part 3 where we talk about making organic textures. Have a great one, everybody. Bye-bye.